Hello everyone, back with another recording here. I'm hoping that this painting can be recorded from start to finish. So I have an hour or so this afternoon to develop the painting a little bit further, and just thought I would share this with all of you. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Um, So in case you haven't seen the first recording for this painting, I would encourage you to go back and watch parts of that video, if not the whole video. I talk a lot about my color choices for different parts of my composition, which I have over here on the lower part of the screen. That's my thumbnail drawing in my sketchbook that I'm using as a reference for the painting. Again, if you're new to this painting demonstration for this particular painting. It's a project that I'm demoing for students in my online class that I'm teaching this semester, and it's all about taking a complementary color palette and appropriating work from a historical artist. So I chose Rene Magritte as my artist of choice, and he made a few of these door paintings that I really enjoyed, that became the basis for my composition that we're seeing in this painting. So in the first video, I blocked in main large elements of my composition, and that was 2 days ago. So the surface is still relatively wet because it's very cold in my studio here at our house in our basement. Areas of this painting are still wet to the touch. So as I'm painting, there are certain things that I won't be able to do with this painting. So there are, excuse me, there are going to be passages that might be dry enough to do kind of like a transparent glaze over. But I already sort of touched areas of the surface and the paint was still wet. So I know that's something that I won't really be able to do on the full surface of this painting. So basically this is just going to be a continuation of the process. I'm going to start to compose what's happening inside of this part of the painting, and I thought that that would be good to share with the class. So let's go ahead and start working. Now, just for kind of a reminder, the pigments I'm using on this painting are titanium white, cadmium yellow medium, ultramarine blue mixed with quinacridone magenta. They give me a nice dark, rich purple here that I can tint up with white. I can sort of neutralize and mute that violet into more of these brown hues that we see on my color chart over there. So yeah, in the first video I talked about wanting to create a contrast of a warmer outer environment in the composition and then a cooler view inside of this sort of doorway here. So on my sketch you can see, hopefully it's kind of small, but you can see the details of a fence and a neighborhood of houses behind that fence. In the last recording I talked about maybe duplicating the fence and having multiple stages of privacy. I thought that would be a really interesting visual, so that's part of what I'll be doing today in this session, is starting to figure out what's happening inside of that part of my painting. So what I want to do first is bring in some of this neutral brown that I had saved from the last session. I'm going to bring a little bit of my violet into this color, and again, I said I wanted to use a cooler palette or side of my palette for this interior rectangle, but I don't want to go right into my most chromatic tinted violet, so I want to keep things relatively neutral for now, or closer to neutral. That way I always have access to make the color more saturated or chromatic and vibrant. So I'm going to make a couple of piles here to give myself a little bit of a range for colors. So This will be my first step for today. And we'll grab a little bit more white over here. Go right into some of the violet. Same thing up here. Slightly lighter value of our violet. Now I'm looking at the values of my shapes in my thumbnail, and I'm trying to think about where I want to enhance or compress those value relationships. So I don't want to use a purple that's too dark too early. But I think this is a wide enough range of colors that I can now start to go in and lay in some of these different details and shapes. So I'll take a little bit of medium, and we'll start with this darker, muted middle tone here. And I'm not going to use Gamsol in today's session. So I think the use of the mineral spirits is probably done for this painting at this point now, because I want to start to build up more of an opacity in certain details of the image. So I'm looking at my thumbnail. I have that down here below my painting attached to my easel, so I can quickly glance down and reference some of the information there. I don't need a lot of paint. Something else that I wanted to mention in this recording today was another tool that we can use to help with the painting process. And let's see, I have what we call a mahl stick. It's spelled M-A-H-L. And basically this is a tool that we can use to press against our easels or along the sides of our paintings. Anything with a stable edge that you can rest this on. The hook was attached so I could hang this on a board or a panel and let it hang on my easel. And it allows me to really sort of wedge this like pivot point here on the end of the mahl stick so it doesn't slide around as easily. But basically this rests against parts of our easel, and our hand can then rest on the mahl stick, and that gives us a much more stable sort of resting place to make different marks with our brushes. And typically we do this when we're trying to get really careful marks and details. It's an optional tool, but if you're struggling to get a particular mark or shape, then that might be a tool that you might want to look for. You can make them out of really simple materials like dowel rods or other long strips of wood, and it's really handy to have at your disposal just in case you get to a point in your process where you want to have a lot more control over your brush. At this point in my painting, I don't really feel like that's necessary, but I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that today during the live stream. Okay, so now I can start to think about my first fence here in the painting. I think it would be really interesting if the top of the fence lined up with the horizon line in the water background. I'm just freehanding my fence posts here. And then I can use my wooden straight edge here to get some really nice straight clean lines. Probably lighten this color up just a little bit here. Not using a lot of medium, this is mostly just the paint. Areas where the line is starting to break and create these gaps are things that I keep an eye on when I'm working on a painting, especially as I'm starting to sketch in information. I'm always thinking about the mark that I made and if it's an interesting element in the composition and if it's worth keeping. We might fall in the habit of wanting to get a clean, straight mark or line or totally filled in shape in the first pass of that area of our painting, and that's okay, but if you do that you might miss out on other surprising textures and shapes. So for me it's more about getting the proportions of each of these boards in the fence and less about getting the right sort of line or mark, because I can always fix that or adjust that later if I need to. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So now the paint that's behind each of these fence posts is still relatively open or wet, so I can take a dry brush here, a soft synthetic dry brush, and kind of blend out that line just so it's easier for me to see where my fence stops or ends. I'm not too worried about the marks that are made now with this darker purple mixing into the background. That's not too big of a concern right now. But if I vary some of those marks, then I can create a more organic transition from what's happening at the bottom of the doorway to the top. And it's going to be a little bit more flexible, which was something I mentioned in the last recording. And now I think it makes sense to start to imagine those receding fences, and honestly it might even be interesting to have these fences block any sort of structures or houses. So I'm going to try to play around with that idea and see how it feels. Just want to scrape off any excess paint that might mix with some of these new colors I'm going to put in here. It wasn't a lot, but it might be enough to make it difficult to read these new lines. basically I'm trying to find the guidelines for where those receding fences are going to hit with their top points. So I'm intuitively deciding what the proportions are going to be for this part of my painting. It's not like I have a thumbnail sketch for this adjustment that I'm making to my design, and that's part of the beauty of working with paint, is that it allows us to make some quick changes. Okay, we'll do the same thing one more time. Maybe it makes sense to just do 3 rows of fences for the painting. I think I'm going to try that out. So I'm going to soften this line that I had made earlier, because I don't want that third fence to be that close. And I'll try to blend out that horizon line that I put in here. Okay, let's do one more fence, and let's make it about probably go up there. Yeah, that feels like a good distance. You know, this distance between these two, it's a little bit longer than what this distance will be, which will be similar to this distance. So I'm thinking a lot in terms of proportions of each of these shapes and elements in the composition, and what feels balanced or what feels interesting. So I think I'm going to go with this and see how it feels. I should probably use a smaller brush though, because the lines are going to be a little thinner. So I'm going to switch to this really small round brush here, and this is a Sable natural hair brush, so it's a pretty soft, flexible brush that has a really nice expressive, springy sort of feel to it. And we're going to take some of this color here. With paint on this brush, it will come to a really nice, clean point. Hopefully you can see that there. And so now I want to make these points even closer together than what was in the second row. So let's start to make these boards a lot closer together. I'll grab a little bit of medium just so that this paint slides a little bit easier. Again, I'm just kind of intuitively placing these lines. I'm not measuring anything. I'm not trying to be super precise. I don't really feel that that's necessary right now with this part of my painting. There's a little bit more of that lighter gray purple in this rectangle. There's a little bit more paint up at the top that's still wet, so it's starting to blend with this darker muted purple, which I think is okay. It's not really going to be the final layer of this part of the painting, most likely. I think what will happen is I'm going to bring this painting upstairs after today's session and see if I can get the paint to dry a little bit faster than when it's just sitting in my studio. And that should help speed things up a little bit. But I'm also going to try to get some of this paint out of here before I put in those vertical lines of the boards. Luckily there's not a lot of paint. Grab this round brush again and my straight edge. So I'm using a little bit of medium to make this paint flow easier. I don't want to put too much paint on my brush because these lines need to be pretty thin. And I can start to place these verticals. Oops, that was a little bit heavy, but that's okay. So the way that I foresee the process building from this step is I'm going to try to make sure that I clean up some of the edges so that I can at least really distinguish what I'm looking at here, and then as this layer dries I can paint on top of those shapes, and I can paint up to or over the line work that I'm putting in today. So this is really just kind of like a drawing stage that I'll be painting and cleaning up as I continue the painting. I'll be painting over a lot of these lines still, or at the very least I'll be trying to thin them out by what we would call cutting into the shape. So a lot of that is sort of playing with positive and negative space. So if let's say the lines are the positive space, I can paint the negative space of the boards, and then when I'm painting that negative space I can determine how much I want to over paint the line work, if I want a thinner line somewhere. And if we allow our process to be layered like this, it kind of releases some of the pressure to get the line perfect this first time. So part of the reason I wanted to record another session is so that way this layer has some time to dry, and then I can get to painting the boards a lot sooner without needing to worry about wet paint. So hopefully by like Wednesday this week, maybe these lines will be fairly dry. Almost there. Now, for your paintings, you may be deciding to work more expressively, more like in terms of a looser representation. Maybe you're working more in an abstract process or approach, so this type of painting might not be suitable for what you're working on right now in terms of an example. But the nice thing about showing these steps is that it helps to see when we might try to solve a certain problem in our paintings. And the more we paint, I think the easier it can become to know how we want to simplify our process and compartmentalize things that we need to get done. So a challenge when we first start to paint is understanding how an artist came to create that work of art that we're looking at, if we're looking at someone else's painting. Because what we see is that final sort of surface, or we're seeing a combination of layers that the artist chose to leave at a particular state of finish. And then what happens is, it can be really challenging to know what did they paint first, or how many layers are below the surface, and how do each of those layers sort of work together to come to that final conclusion where we can look at the image and make sense of it and understand what it is we're looking at. And as we make our paintings, I think that also becomes easier for us to know what to do first, or what can maybe be resolved at a later point in the process. Now, if you're trying to finish a painting in one sitting, then you're going to have to solve every problem while the paint is wet and all at once, which, that could lead to some really interesting results too. But each type of process, whether you're working more directly or indirectly, is going to offer some different conditions for the paint. And like right now, one of the benefits of having this lighter purpley color at the top still be wet is that it allows me to go in and soften or blend out the lines that I don't want in the painting, and I don't have to like paint over that line. I can just blend it into the color behind it. And again, that's one of these benefits of working with oils, is that it allows us to have just a wider realm of time to make changes and to experiment with our paintings, with things being open and wet for a lot longer than acrylic paintings or other mediums. Now, obviously, you can add mediums to acrylics and you can play with that drying speed, but in general, you're going to end up with a dry painting a lot faster than you would with oils, I would say, in general. So I just want to adjust a little bit of these edges now that I have a smaller brush in hand that I can really go through and clean up where things are overlapping, because I might not paint over some of these lines, right? So this is where you can kind of decide, if you're working in a way that is similar to what I'm doing, you can decide, do I like that mark? Do I like that line? Should I leave it alone? Do I want to keep it for the final image of my painting. Um, you know, I think most of us want to be efficient when we're working, so we don't want to have to come back and repaint the same line 10 times, um, or maybe even twice, more than twice. But the beauty of working with an open medium is that you have a little bit more time to make those adjustments and to really decide if you like what you're looking at. Which for me at the moment, I think this is working well. I like the repetition. I like how there's like a multiplying effect of the number of boards in each fence. I like that we're seeing more and more boards. There's sort of like this accumulation happening. I don't, like I said, I don't think I need a fourth row of a fence in this design. I like how in the image that we see on screen here, we have a little bit of a suburban environment. Now that I've gone higher up into this portion of my design, maybe I won't show as many houses, or maybe it'll be like the top sort of rooftops of a couple of houses as the space sort of pushes back. Honestly, too, I think part of me is open to maybe not putting anything there. Maybe it's really just about the privacy and the fences and that sort of sense of exclusion, or of you know, not being able to access part of the painting. I like that there's a hidden quality happening now, and how that's going to feel relative to the like water details at the bottom, which that's probably what I'll work on now. So I'm gonna leave this alone for right now and spend some time drawing what I want the foreground of my composition to look like. So let's see here. I want to have a color that's a little bit warmer, just as like a base that I can mix into slightly cooler and slightly warmer versions of my palette. Let's grab a little bit of titanium white and let's wipe that off. A little bit of my violet over here. A little bit more violet. What I would really like to have happen is that the sky in the background and the horizon of the water in the background, both of those shapes are really warm. That's what I'm hoping. And then as we move towards the bottom of the painting, the color becomes a little bit more neutral, kind of like this realm of my chart. And then as we move up into this space, it gets more and more cool in temperature. Relative to the yellow side of my chart. So this color becomes really important between those two different zones of contrast. And now that I have a slightly warmer muted yellow, I can use that to mix in with these cooler ones to get a nice sort of range and balance between those hues in my palette. So I want to start with, again, somewhat of a neutral color. I don't want to go too chromatic too early. Let's grab some medium. I just want to make this a consistency that's easier to draw my shapes in with. And at some point I need to reestablish the frame of the door, and kind of remind myself where the door meets the water, which I want to say is right down here. This is kind of the base of the frame over on that side, and then this will be the base of the frame over on this side. just so I don't forget the width of the door frame. I want to put 2 lines in there. And now I can start to play around with the feeling of water kind of pooling in and spraying up around the side of the door. Now, since this is a very organic subject, I think it makes sense not to use the mall stick for something like this. When we're painting a particular type of form that has a organic character, so if you're painting, let's say, grass on a lawn, or fur on an animal, or hair on a figure, think about the way you're making your marks. You might be able to kind of mimic the flow and the feel of the line work just on the way that you're holding the tool and the amount of control you're allowing yourself to have with that tool. So, I'm going to use that logic to hopefully get to some really interesting lines and shapes for this part of my painting. Now, the paint is sticking a lot here, so I'm going to take a little bit more medium. Now at this part of my process too, again, I'm referencing my sketch, my thumbnail. That was the purpose of making the thumbnail, right? Is so that I can think about shape, I can think about line, I can think about values, and ideally your thumbnail is going to give you a lot of clues towards what it is you want to try to portray in the painting, and it's going to help solve some of these problems before you get to the painting. Because if I didn't have my thumbnail, I would just be designing this painting as I'm working, and that can get really sort of tricky in my opinion. I think we can end up fiddling a lot with different ideas, and the longer we spend portraying one of our ideas, I feel like the harder it becomes to change what we've been doing in the painting. We kind of start to become attached, I think. And typically if you come up with an idea not based on a sketch and just right directly into the painting, we can kind of convince ourselves that that's the right solution to a visual problem, and then later on, once we've had some time away from the painting, or we're looking back on the painting, we might realize actually that idea doesn't really work very well for what it was I was trying to convey. And so by making thumbnails, you can start to experiment in a much more manageable scale and with materials that are not quite so complicated, especially if you're just working with graphite pencils. All right, so I should be careful not to outline continuously each of these shapes that I'm painting in, because I don't want this to appear too flat and sort of geometric or cartoony. I want this to feel more volumetric and dimensional. I want this water to feel like it's really there, and that it has a sense of volume. So if I break up my lines, I think that will really help start to convey that form a little bit more accurately, in a more convincing way. So let's see. So I'm just improvising different lines, thinking about the texture, the flow, This is all just out of my imagination. I'm not really referencing anything. And that's intentional for the painting. Now, there's no rule in this painting that says you can't, or this project that says you can't, combine references and look at different imagery. So feel welcome to collect reference material if you feel inclined to do so. So I like the idea of the water sort of crashing into this door from the other side and splashing as these waves are coming in. So I want to make sure that my marks give a sense of that movement and that action, that active mark. That kind of like spraying effect. Now, if I don't like a mark that I make, I can always paint over it later too. That's where my head is at. I'm not really trying to finalize anything. I'm still in that stage with this part of the design where I feel like, well, I'm not quite sure what it is I'm looking for, but I need to make different marks and then see how it feels in the painting, because it's going to feel different in the painting than it will in your thumbnail. So don't feel too stressed out if what you like about the thumbnail isn't coming through in the painting, especially this early on in the process. I would really focus more on playing with marks, playing with color contrasts, really allowing yourself to take some chances with both of those aspects of your paintings. Grab some more yellow just to bring the value of this color up a little bit. That way it doesn't have quite as high of a contrast as I'm working up in towards the horizon line. Maybe a little bit of white as well. Something I'll do a lot when I'm working on a painting from imagination like this is that typically I'll try to get as much information into the painting as I can without any kind of direct reference material. And then if I hit a point where I'm like, this really isn't reading as naturally or as convincingly as I wanted, then I'll go search for reference material too. So that's another thing to keep in mind is, if you don't like something that's happening in your painting, you can always go and collect information and collect some references, and come back to your painting with um, a better informed perspective with designing shapes, with thinking about value and other color properties. Um, I say that kind of as an example of, we don't need to have everything figured out before we start the painting. That's sort of the reason why I'm saying this. It can be paralyzing sometimes to feel like, oh, I have to have the full drawing done. I have to be able to, sort of differentiate what my palette is going to do. And that's not necessarily true. I think each artist works differently along that spectrum of information. Some people start a painting and they have no idea what it is they're trying to do, and it's a very open-ended process, and that's a great way to work too, depending on what it is you want to get out of your process. So with this assignment, because we're borrowing elements from another artist's work, we're thinking a little bit more early on in our process of ways to connect ideas, of ways to, borrow formal choices of compositions, of color properties, of values, to be able to build off of and use in our own work. So, there's a lot kind of going on as you're working through this assignment. All right, I feel pretty happy with the line work there. I think I can probably move on a little bit into some of the other darker pieces of information in here, and maybe even playing a little bit more with what's happening in those shapes in terms of color. So one thing I don't particularly like right now is how consistent this violet color is. So I want to vary that slightly. I'm going to try using a warmer muted color here. Let's see how this is going to look. Bring that down here. I can darken this shape. Might be a little too dark. It's pretty neutral. Yeah, actually I like that color a lot. Now, if I want this to feel like sand, I need to really think about my edges and the texture of these shapes. keep repainting this shape at the bottom because it feels really, really dark compared to this one over here. And what can happen is as we're painting, we can start to have this sort of like tunnel vision of small areas in our paintings, kind of like this, right? So I can be hyper focused on the relationships of three different shapes, and it can feel like those contrasts are really, really drastic. But in the full painting, things might not actually be quite as extreme. So it's important to move or scale your sense of focus when we think about contrasts continuously from thinking about things, you know, up close or side by side, and then within the full painting. So we're kind of like doing this a lot with our focus with things in the painting. All right, so starting to feel better about what I'm seeing. I don't know if I really like how warm and kind of pinkish purple this color is here. I kind of feel like it needs to be a little bit more neutral. So I'm going to try something here. The other thing that's kind of throwing me off is the color and value of the fence. I mean, that's something that I need to, at some point soon, I should figure out. Is it going to be a lighter fence? Is it going to be a darker fence? Is it going to be kind of in the middle of the value scale? And then that'll help me decide other values and other details in the painting. But because I want this to be a cooler section of the composition in terms of color temperature, I'm going to start to add in a slightly neutral mixture here that's going to make this feel cooler in temperature. I'm just varying my mark, kind of working like in a slightly impressionistic way where I'm not just filling in the entire shape, I'm just placing small dabs of that color into this larger shape. So that way it can create this sort of perceptual gradient, right, from cooler to more neutral to eventually warmer in terms of temperature. But yeah, let's see if I lean back just to kind of see how things are looking. I feel like it's getting closer to my idea. I think what would be helpful right now is to reestablish the frame of the door. I think that'll be a really important line in the painting because it's going to help gauge some of my other values. So I'm thinking of that as being one of the darkest values in the entire painting. So let's grab some of this violet. I'm trying to make a dark neutral color here. Let's grab a little bit more paint. I don't want to run out of this color, so let's grab a little bit of yellow just to neutralize it. I like this color, but it does feel really, really dark. I'm going to lighten this up a little bit. Maybe I'll use a little bit more yellow just to keep it more in the middle between warm and cool. Okay, let's start with this and see how it feels. So what's going to happen now is because this is such a dark value, it's going to stand out a lot compared to the values inside the doorway and around the door. And it's going to make it feel like this door is sort of sitting closer to us in terms of depth in the painting because this value is so dark in contrast to the other values. Now, this is kind of like what I was talking about before with the line work in the fence. Um, all of those lines, I can always go back over this passage with this lighter violet gray or the yellow of the sky behind the door to clean up the edge. Right now, what I'm really thinking a lot about is the boldness or the width of this line. How thick should this line be to make sense in my painting? While also trying to keep an eye on things like, does it look level? Does it feel like it's at too much of an angle? So that's the other thing I'm trying to think about and keep an eye on as well. There's a possibility that what might happen is I might realize, you know what, this color is too dark in the painting. I can always paint over this with a lighter value or shifts in color temperature, chroma, and this is partially going in right now just as a marker for the subject in the painting, right? I need to be able to see the door frame to be able to then compare my other values, my other proportions. So it's important to establish this sooner than later. Now, if you're worried about doing something like this and keeping your line really straight, you could take a straight, edge tool like a ruler or something and draw a line with pencil. I've done that before, and then I can just see the two different lines, and that becomes a really easy way to fill in that shape. But for today, right now, I'm just going to keep freehanding this. On this side, I think I'm going to use my straight edge tool. Which I should actually wipe off first. Got a little bit of extra paint on here. So I line this up. Gives me a pretty clean edge. While I have this out, I might as well go over to this side and clean up and straighten out this edge over here. That looks a lot better on that side. looks pretty good on this side too. The top of the doorway is definitely not perpendicular. I gotta fix this too. It looks a little bit better. Now when I flip this over, it's a little harder to tell if things are lined up properly, but I can at least go through and clean up this other edge. But yeah, much happier with this now. I think the weight of the lines, I like how that relates to the dimensions of each of the fence boards and other shapes in the painting at this point. Now, if I want to, I can kind of complete this edge in here. Kind of like that. That looks pretty good. The other thing that kind of is interesting right now with this particular composition is that it's hard to tell if this is a door or a mirror, and I like how ambiguous that is. So I've been debating whether or not it makes sense to add in like a little detail of the door being open, or like the thin width of a door kind of on one side of this frame. But now, you know, it kind of opens up an interesting question of the space and the subject matter. This is something that'll happen as we're working through different paintings as well, as this idea that you might start out knowing what your painting is depicting or about, and partway through a new idea can emerge, and then you have the option and the choice to decide which thread you want to follow. And for me, that's always one of the most exciting parts about painting, is that you can change your mind, you can respond to a new decision that you've made in the process. And chances are, if you have kind of a mental image or idea of your painting before you begin, or when you're starting the painting, you might start to think of that differently once you're actually seeing your vision on your painting, or like on your surface. And to me, that's always one of the more interesting aspects of painting, is that you can have an idea kind of like this here, and it can feel completely different once it's a painted image, or it can start to morph into different ideas. So as you're working on your paintings, that's something else I would highly encourage being open to, is this idea that things can change, right? And you don't have to stick to your first idea. And again, because we're working in a material that is very open, and we can layer ideas, we can cover up things, it's actually a really helpful medium for keeping an open mind as artists. I'm just going to go in and put in some darker values here while I have this color on my palette. what I'm thinking about right now is this feeling of water crashing into the backside of this door or mirror. And what would that water look like as it's hitting and splashing up? So if the light source in this aquatic space is, let's say, directly above, then all of the light would be shining down, right? So all of that water would have highlights, kind of like my hand, right? Where a lot of the highlights are at the top of my fingertips. Or if the water is getting sprayed up more horizontally, right, we have a illuminated side and a shadow side under here. So I'm thinking about how I want to place the light source in my painting. In my sketch, you can see above the door over here, kind of like right down here, is the little circle for a potential sun in the painting. I don't know if I'm going to keep that in there. I kind of like the idea of maybe lowering the sun so that it's more of a raking light that we're looking into. But if that's the case, if the sun is behind the door, then the light would be coming towards us, and that water that's being sprayed up is going to be illuminated, and more light is going to come through the water that we're looking at. So I'm thinking about increasing the chroma of that water spray, and that might help start to convey that sense of where the light source is coming from. Also, if that's the case, then there would be a shadow being cast by the door or by the mirror. So I also have to figure out, like, depending on where the sun is positioned, if it's on this side, then our shadow would move like this, right? If the sun is over here, our shadow would move this direction. And if it's right behind the door in the middle, we'd have a straight, kind of shadow where the light is being blocked. So I need to also figure that out. But for right now, what I want to do is just bring in a slightly darker color to show this spray, kind of illuminated spray here. Or yellow. What I'll probably end up doing is, once I know what the shape of the spray is going to look like, I can put a really bright rim light around that shape, and it'll make it feel like it's kind of glowing around that airborne shape of the water. So I also want to think about the sense of movement in my marks here. I can kind of like feather this out a little bit like this. Hopefully, when I continue to work on this painting, I'll remember what some of these ideas were going to be, and I don't kind of end up painting over one of the ideas. That can be a challenge too while you're working, and I have the benefit right now of recording the process, so if I forget, I can always go back into these recordings. But if I wasn't recording, something that might help avoid that chance of, painting over one of your ideas, or forgetting what the concept morphed into, is to write in notes in your sketchbook, kind of by your thumbnails. As you're finding those ideas, I would jot them down so you don't forget. It also can help you, like, down the road, years down the road, to go back in and revisit your process, and you can see, how did you get to that idea in your process. But that looks pretty good for right now in terms of that backlit shape. Let's go in here. What I'd like to do before I start to wrap up the recording is start to get a little bit of variety down here in the waves and colors of the water. This way I can start to vary some of those shapes and lines and textures to make the foreground a little bit more active. Now, one of the other things I can do is really think about how soft or sharp these lines are going to be. And typically I'll think about that in relationship to the subject matter. So because this is a very organic, flowy passage of my painting, it kind of makes sense to keep some of these lines and edges a little bit softer for as long as possible. So I'm taking a dry synthetic brush, and it's really soft. You can see how flexible it is, and I'm just very lightly touching the surface and softening some of these edges. Again, this is because I don't want this area of my painting to feel too flat and kind of geometric or graphic. I prefer if this red is being more dimensional, more natural. Excuse me. We're getting pretty close to finishing this for today. And like I said, I'm hoping to try to get these layers to dry over the next couple of days, and then that'll allow me to do techniques of glazing, and I can really start to think about translucency of my paint, building up the layers with really thin passages of the paint. Also go through and soften some of these marks back here. I think this is probably a good place to stop for today, and I'll make sure to try and record any future progress on this painting if possible. You know, if I'm in class, I probably won't be able to record the process, but if I'm not in class, I will make sure to try and do so. I think actually what I should probably do here is create a neutral with what's left on my palette, because that's been really helpful and handy for future sessions. This allows me to have a pre-mixed muted color that I can build from or add into more chromatic mixtures if I'm trying to tone down the chroma, things like that. And the nice thing about working with a limited palette like this is that I don't need a lot of space on my palette for the mother colors, those initial colors that I'm using. So what I can do is I can just keep this same spot on the palette for these kind of big muted mixtures of color at the end of each session. So I'm going to take this pile and place it right here again, and if I can make it a nice clean you know, sort of blob of paint, then if it does dry before I work on this painting again, at least it's just the outer skin of the paint. So if you're doing that, if you're trying to save your paint, one thing I would recommend is to make sure that you don't thin out that pile, because then you're giving more surface area to dry out in that paint. Just wipe this off real quick. But you know, overall, I'm happy with where the painting is moving. I really like the sort of pivot in terms of the idea to move away from kind of a domestic, suburban image and just think about a more simple motif like the fence itself, and the feeling it can create by repeating that as an element in the painting. I think that opens up some interesting ideas. So eventually what will happen is I'll start to think about like the shifts in color properties between each of these groupings of the fence boards. I'll have to think, do I want the farthest one to be darkest or the lightest one or the closest one to be darkest, things like that. I can also start to think more about temperature. Like right now there's kind of a gradient happening, where this fence here is a lot more yellow and warm compared to this one back here. I kind of like what's happening, just like easing us into this distant, very cold environment, I think would be really interesting. So there's a good chance I'm going to follow that process through and see what happens. But yeah, the other thing I'm also foreseeing is potentially doing some research in collecting imagery for waves crashing, especially backlit waves, because like I said, I might put like a little sun somewhere behind this doorway mirror object. Maybe I could even look up like lens flare effects where maybe the sun is partially behind the frame. So we'll see how that goes. But thank you for watching this video. I hope this again is helpful as an example, as a demonstration. If anything, I'm just glad to be recording the full process, at least from the very beginning. That way, for my students, they can really see when I start to approach different steps in the process, and in my opinion, when I think it's really helpful to dictate what it is you really need to be focusing on at what stage of your painting. So again, like I said before, this was still kind of like the drawing stage of the painting. I'm starting to get into the language of the water, how I want to kind of describe that part of the painting. Some of what happened in here I'm not totally in love with, but you kind of have to try something to realize whether or not you like it. So the good news is I can paint over this and keep playing with those transitions and marks as we move forward. But again, I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next recording. Have a nice day.